and I'll give those back. I am certain that we need 2 classes for this chapter. So that means when you look at the schedule, we're going to bump down. Alright, so we will finish chapter 9 on Wednesday, we'll do the review on Friday, and the exam will be on Monday. Okay? So, make ready for your review Friday, be sure, because we've had a long break. And if we need to go over anything from the previous chapters, that's our chance. Right? And we'll do a bit of video work as well, so that we kind of remind ourselves what's going on here. And I forgot the clickers. So. Alright, so chapter 9, then we've looked at the development of locomotive skills in chapter 7, we looked at ballistic skills in chapter 8. Chapter 9, we're looking at manipulation and manipulative skills. And in many textbooks, what you'll have are locomotive skills and object control. They don't split them up into ballistic and manipulative. So it just depends which book you're looking at. Hayward and Getchell like to change chapter to kind of highlight the difference. Mechanically, the ballistic skills, throwing, kicking, punting, are quite similar as a group. And perceptually, manipulation skills are a lot more tricky. Trying to catch a ball is way, way more complicated from a motor control point of view than throwing the ball. Although throwing the ball is mechanically more complicated, from a perception and a catch, that's a lot harder. Right? If I'm throwing, I'm in charge. I have the ball, I get to throw it when I want to get it, I get to throw it how I want. If I've got to intercept another object, now I'm not in control. So, a lot harder. And when we're looking at manipulation type skills, be thinking about what does that involve. Often we're using our hands. Good soccer players would count, right? Fine motor skills, control of the ball, dribbling the ball, but most of us are not that skilled with our feet. But we do a lot of manipulating with our hands. Opposable thumbs make a big difference in what we see in humans versus other mammals. The size of my hand compared to the thing I'm manipulating. The length of my limb, where do I put my hand? So be thinking about those kinds of ideas. We want to always come back to our constraints triangle. What are some individual constraints that might impact catching, and how would those change across the lifespan? So always come back and think about those ideas when you're looking at the work. So grasping, we're going to start with grasping because that's the first manipulation skill we see. Technical term is prehension, okay? But picking something up. When you watch young children, so when you watch our kids on the playground, particularly the youngest children in the second class out, because they are very young. What we see with infants and young children is their brain trying to learn about an object. If you think about it, grasping an object would involve understanding something about the object, otherwise how do you pick it up? Right? Now, as adults, we don't do any thinking about that, right? We just walk over and pick something up. But when we're young and we don't have experience of objects, we need to know something about that object. And what we see with young children is something that we call haptic perception. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking a lot at the development of perception. Haptic perception is things I can learn, things I can perceive about an object without having to look at it. Right? So when we watch young children, they touch things a lot. They poke things. Right? Some of the children still poke us. Okay? Some of that is attention getting, but some of it is their brain learning still about objects. Right? So what kinds of things can I learn about an object that I don't have to look at it? Right? That I could just feel it in a dark room and I would know something. Right? So when we look at haptic perception, then we have some ideas of, let's see, the weight, right? I can tell the weight of an object without seeing it. Okay? I can pick it up and feel it. Just a minute. And I can tell the temperature of something without seeing it. I can get a rough idea of its size. I can tell whether it's hard or soft. Texture and shape. Oops. Right? So we're going to come back to this idea in a little while, but these things play a role when we look at what we see children do when they're starting to grasp. Right? So we're going to come back to this idea of haptic perception in a couple of slides, but you've got to bear in mind that an infant, a 1-year-old, an 18-month-old doesn't understand things they're looking at the way you do. Right? So it's a little abstract when we're trying to explain this idea. Okay. So early on in PE literature, motor development didn't exactly exist in the 1930s. We were looking at motor control, PE type ideas. Researcher was looking at the phases of development. And we mentioned when we looked at the early movements in the babies that they change from this power to a precision grip. Right? I do something big before I do something small. And the problem with this piece of literature was that they used one item. So whichever age infant or adult they tested, they only used one thing. They actually used a little 1-inch red brick. So what they decided was that there's these 10 phases of development and that young children aren't as advanced as older children and adults in grasping. The problem was the size of the toy. Okay? Because obviously for a baby to pick up a 1-inch cube, we don't have very much fine motor control. We've got our midline out going on. Right? So I don't have very good control yet of my fingers. They're one of the last things I get. So picking up something very small is quite tricky. So they look like they can't do it. When they reran the study later on, what they saw was that actually, if I give them a developmentally appropriate sized object, then they do something very similar to adults. Right? So even before 1 year old, we see them move their hand around to make the right kind of shape to pick something up. Make sense? So for example, right, if you're going to pick up a ball, right, if we put a tennis ball here, okay, and you watch an adult or an older child go to pick up a ball, what do they do with their hand? Okay. Or they might cut their fingers if they're going to pick it up. Just okay. So when we as adults pick something up, we make the shape that's appropriate to pick the thing up that we want to pick up. And we see that in young children. Now, pincer grips are a key motor milestone. Parents don't tend to look for it because they're so busy looking for walking that they don't realize that a pincer grip is very important. But trying to pick something up using our opposable thumb is a big milestone. Somewhere around 9 to 10 months, children will get a pincer grip, right? So, if you're at a restaurant or a coffee bar, right, and mum has baby there and she's chucked out the Cheerios on the table or on the tray in the baby chair, and baby is scrunching up Cheerios like this, baby's not 9 or 10 months old yet, because if they're 9 or 10 months old, they start picking up Cheerios and raisins. So you've got an idea based on the behaviour you see as to what age that child may be, because typically they don't scrunch unless they're throwing a tantrum and they're being different, and there's always a if, but they're going to use their pincer grasp if they can, if you give them little things to eat. Letting go takes a lot longer, right? So that comes later on. But what we found was 10 phases of what you can see. Those 10 phases still seem to hold true. Like the idea that there's 10 different types of grips, it's just that we see them at different ages and in different contexts depending upon the object size and the shape of the object. So one of the developmental lists that we have for grasping, they might initially, remember we've got random involuntary movements, so they may hit a toy accidentally. If they hit the toy in the palm of their hand, they're going to close their fingers, we're going to see palmar grasp, and they may look like they grasp the toy, but it's involuntary, so it's not grasping. Okay? Grasping is voluntary. They might be making some contact. By around 2 months, we start to see something much more deliberate. But they'll use their whole hand in one piece to pick something up. Often they'll come down on the top, but even if they come at the side, they use their whole hand together. We don't see use of the opposable thumb at 2 months. By 3 months, they start to move their hand around, depending on how they want to pick it up. It's not till about 4 months that we start to see the thumb doing something different from the rest of the hand. Okay? And 5 to 6 months, before they'll pick up with their fingers and not the palm of their hand. The other thing you can look for is how strong is the shoulder, right? What are they doing? Do they have to have the arm supported in order to pick the toy up? Or can they pick the toy up with the arm up in the air? That's another thing that we can look for. So during the week, okay, this stuff is easier to understand if you play around with it when you're not in class. Right? You want to start noticing. The whole thing about motor development, what for me makes it really fun, is that we're all doing it all the time. Right? So at any point during the week, you can see this going on. Whether you're at lunch in the car, whether you're in a classroom, whether you're watching the teacher pick up a pen, right? You can see this stuff for yourself. So just be playing around with it during the week. When you watch someone pick out a coin out of their pocket to put it into a soda machine, right? What are they doing? What's happening? Right? What do they look like picking out a coin versus picking up a piece of chalk? Or picking up a heavy bag versus a bag that doesn't weigh very much. Okay? Then, in the late 80s, we got some really interesting information that gives a clue that we body scale grip movements and objects. So when we look at children who are 8, 9 and 10 and we give them something to pick up, what they do is basically the same as an adult given the same relative size. So the ratio of the size of their hands to the object you're asking them to pick up. At what point do I switch from picking something up with one hand to picking something up with two hands? Right? So, IB, go pick up George. Right? Kelly. And he uses two hands. So two hands doesn't mean infant, doesn't mean baby. It's the ratio of the size of his hand to the object you're asking him to pick up. Now, if he picks up his water bottle, doesn't use two hands. If we do that with an 8-year-old and we scale George down so that the ratio of George to their hand size was the same, and the bottle was the same, we'd see the same thing. So the ratio is the key. What size are your hands versus what is it you're being asked to pick up seems to drive the behavior. When you do that test with children younger than 8, the rule doesn't hold true. So it's something to do with your brain's perception of the shape, the size, the weight of the object. Right? George looks like he's quite heavy. So you're not going to try picking him up with one hand, right? This stretch box is not a lot smaller than George, but why would I use two hands? It's lighter, and I know it's lighter, so I don't have to try to pick it up with two hands, right? But my understanding of the object drives what I do. So for a long time, at that point where children are transitioning from random arm movements that are mostly involuntary to something that is deliberately trying to get to a bottle or a toy or a piece of food or mum. For a long time, people thought that what was going on there in that transition was the brain trying to work out what to do with the hand in order to grab the thing it was picking up, because that seemed logical. But actually, what they're finding now is that with young children, they do a lot of infant work. There's a lot of people studying infants. It's easy. They're easy to get hold of. You know, you just put out a notice in the baby clinics, and they're relatively easy to do research with, because unless they're crying, they kind of do what you want them to do when you need it done, and it's easy to film them. And it doesn't really seem to be changing the hand shape at this point in time. It's more about the brain learning how to move the arm. If I have to pick something up, rule 1, right? What do I have to do to move something? What did Newton's law say? Apply a force. So, if I want my hand to go from here to here, I have to apply a force, right? Well, that's great. What do I have to do then in order to pick it up? Stop it, decelerate, apply another force, right? So, in order to grasp something, I have to accelerate and decelerate at the right time to make contact with the thing. It's actually very complicated, right? I love this topic. I love this topic. It's hugely complicated. It's a load of fun. Right? So, accelerate, decelerate. I don't just accelerate, because then I knock everything over. Okay? So, learning to control the arm in the more recent research seems to be more important early on, until we get enough experience at grasping, and then you start to match hand shape. Don't worry too much about hand-mouth, but we do see a lot of hand. Remember, the mouth has most nerve endings, so young children put things in their mouth in order to do our haptic perception. Right? Initially, haptic perception occurs with the mouth. I can tell whether something's hard, I can tell if something's cold. So they become more consistent as voluntary movement kicks in at moving things to their mouth. So they know it's there, but they move it to their mouth, and then they start mouthing. Okay? By about 5, they open the mouth on the way. So they're starting to make the connection with what's my arm doing in relation to where my mouth is. Okay? Anticipation becomes crucial when we start looking at catching. So, 2 months, we start to move both arms at the same time. It's easier for the brain to move both arms. They're not exactly symmetrical. Often one hand is slightly in front, but both sides of my brain can do it at the same time rather than trying to disassociate and do one side. Takes a while for the brain to get to one-handed and doing something else with the other hand. Right? Think about also, how many times do you use 2 hands to manipulate something? If I give you a can of baked beans and a can opener, right? Not a fancy electrical stuck on the wall thing, that's cheating. A regular can of baked beans and a can opener, what do? You're hungry. What do? What would you do?
Holding open. Right, okay, so hold.
Right, okay. So you would do something different with both hands, but you would still manipulate bimanually under certain circumstances as an adult. Right? Squeezing a tube of toothpaste onto your toothbrush. Right? Not very often do we leave the toothbrush just sitting on the countertop and try to squeeze the toothpaste because we know we're going to make a mess. So we hold the toothbrush and we squeeze with the other hand. So bimanual manipulation isn't an infant thing, it's a context-driven idea. And then by about 1 year old, we start to see the good pulling things apart, sticking things back in, so mathematically all kinds of concepts are beginning. How much force do I have to apply to pull things apart? What object fits in what hole? Right? So it's a good time for all those great toys, stickle bricks, little wooden boxes with cubes and triangles and circles cut out that you stick things in. Right? Because the brain is learning a lot about shapes and sizes, and the child is learning how to grasp and change hand positions on the toys. So there's kind of more than one thing going on when you look at those kinds of toys. About 1.5 years before we see cooperation, so they'll do 2 hands or 1 hand, but 1 hand doing one thing and 1 hand doing something else. So if I'm gonna hold on to something and put something in, right, that takes a while. So we need a lot of haptic information at this point. Let me just see. I don't want to go across yet. Let's go back here. Ooh. So, remember, what can I find out about the object without having to look at it? So, not colour, because I can't feel colour. So, weight, temperature, size, texture, shape, hard or soft. So all the time that they're playing with things and they're doing grasping, touching, stroking, prodding, anything manipulative, they're learning this information. So when they're using things as tools, I've got to know whether it's hard or soft. How much force do I apply? How much grip do I have to use to hold on to it? Now, did anybody broken their wrist? Aha. What was it like trying to manage with only 1 hand?
I did it when I was young too.
Oh.
So, it wasn't like.
How old were you?
Like 5, 4.
Unusual.
Yeah, it wasn't fun.
So that would have been pretty big impact then at 5 and 4. Which hand?
My bad.
And are you left-handed or right-handed? Right, it's very difficult when you're in a cast and then you're trying to open a jar. Now, posture. So, if I'm going to reach and touch something, or even if I'm just going to grasp something and pick it up, that adds mass to my body, changes my center of gravity. What if I was leaning forwards when I picked it up? Might cause me to tip over. When infants can't sit up unaided, You see that a lot. They try to pick something up and they just tip over and land on their face, or they tip backwards. Okay? About 8 months before they can sit upright unsupported. So we see a lot going on with grasping after 8 months. The kids that butt scoot rather than creeping on hands and knees, you tend to see slightly more advanced grasping in those children because their hands are free, but they're able to self-locomote, unlike the children who are creeping on hands and knees. So what postural constraints then might alter grasping? What do I have to be able to do?
Bend the waist.
Bend at the waist, so I've got to be flexible enough, right? Deal with gravity, so I've got to be strong enough when I add that extra mass that it doesn't make me collapse. Right? Once we look at trying to stand up, I've got to have enough strength and control over all the muscles in my hips to keep this big wibbly wobbly thing steady as I try to pick something up. All right, in adults, not a lot of literature in adults on grasping. We do see some decline after the age of 50. Often that's because your hands aren't as strong. So if you don't play tennis, or you don't weight train, or you don't use a grip machine or a ball on a regular basis, you lose strength in your hands very quickly, and everything becomes a little trickier, right? Generally, coordination, if you look at someone who's writing their name, the amount of force that they have to apply to the pen to make it write the name, that's pretty consistent. Coordination can sometimes get a little bit out of whack, so your signature might not look quite the same as it did 20 years earlier. But lots of practice makes a big difference. So, if you fly a plane and you've got lots of aiming button things to do, or you're driving a stick shift, not an automatic car, then that practice, the fact that you know how to do that skill so well, can offset some loss of strength in the hand, right? Because you're really good at the skill. You don't have to look at your hand to change gear. Right, we've already mentioned accelerating and decelerating. In older adults, they don't accelerate as well because they're losing strength. And so the deceleration phase is a lot longer, so the whole thing tends to be a little, it looks different to someone who's younger because where they're applying the deceleration within the movement pattern is slightly different. If you walk into your kitchen and your kettle's boiling over, right, how quickly can you aim and turn something off? If you're flying a plane, any of you fly, right? How quickly? Do I only have to hit one button? Do I have to hit a sequence of buttons? The older I get, I can hit the one button, but hitting the sequence would slow down. Okay. Questions, ideas. So reaching Reaching and grasping when we're young are two separate skills. All right, for a young child, moving their arm out and getting somewhere near the object and then grasping the object kind of occurs in two separate plots of time. As an adult, that doesn't happen very often, right? If you're walking through the kitchen and you want to pick up your cup of coffee, you don't have to stand there, move your arm out, grab the cup of coffee and walk away. You can pick it up as you go. So reaching and grasping becomes one movement in adults that it isn't in young children. When you go through puberty, we've already mentioned a couple of times, boys in particular seem to get a little bit clumsy going through puberty because the length of the arm and the weight of the arm is changing so rapidly that during that reach and grasp, what the brain has to do to control that skill changes a lot. And the brain has to relearn how to control the arm. Right? If I'm going to successfully pick something up, then the accuracy of reaching and grasping becomes really important. What makes it more important? What would be an instance where picking it up accurately would be way more important than at another time? I can think of a couple of different situations where picking it up accurately would be really important.
Doctor?
If you're a doctor, oh yes, that one. I haven't thought of that one. What? Sports. Possibly, right? If you're fielding a ground ball or something, right? What about if you're at your grandmother's and she has her great-grandmother's crystal horse statue? Right? That would be pretty important to be accurate, wouldn't it? So I'm not just going to reach out. Two things happen. A, I'm going to slow this down. I might use two hands, not one hand. I'm going to look at my hand. Okay? Now, if you're in McDonald's and you've got a cup of water with a lid and a straw, do you watch your hand all the way to the cup as you pick it up? Right? Because the consequence of dropping the cup of water is very, very different to the consequence of dropping the great, 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 great crystal horse. Okay? So that's something else to look for during the week. When do people visually control reaching and grasping as an adult? And when do we just use our peripheral vision and pick something up as we go along? Right? What drives? Hot cup of coffee, cold glass of water. Start to pay attention to detail. That's the thing, right? Use your eyes, watch things, watch behavior. That's what motor development is all about. What am I seeing someone do? How do I explain what I'm seeing? Right? You've got to be able to see it. You've got to watch for it. You've got to be observant about people's motor patterns. And then you can start trying to explain why you see what you see. So on Wednesday then, we're going to start looking at reaching and grasping in a sport context, okay? In an actual PE skill, catching.